Hatred often arrives grinning, convinced it has the upper hand. In the quiet southern town of Mason Pines, where the night shifts hum low and danger hides in routine, 4 gang members stormed a gas station, certain they'd found easy prey. A lone black woman behind the counter, quiet and still. To them, Tasha Daniels was just another target. They didn't know she was a former Army hand-to-hand combat instructor and an undefeated regional MMA champion. Beneath her calm was control, discipline, and devastating skill. By the time they reached for her, they had already triggered a fight they couldn't possibly win. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead was the only steady sound left after midnight. Beyond the thin glass walls of Viola's Gas and Go, the southern night stretched out quiet and heavy, broken only by the occasional sigh of tires on distant asphalt. The place sat just off Highway 81, on the edge of a tired town called Mason Pines, a dot on the map with more silence than people and more history than it wanted to admit. Tasha Daniels stood behind the counter, arms folded loosely across her chest, watching the monitor that displayed the 4 camera angles around the station. Her reflection in the dusty plexiglass was still, unbothered, but far from relaxed. The gas station was barely lit. A pale glow spilled from the overhead bulbs onto the cracked concrete outside, where 2 pumps stood like aging sentinels. A flickering neon sign buzzed in a corner window, throwing a dull red tint across a stack of faded snack displays. Inside, the air was clean but stale, touched by motor oil and coffee grounds. Nothing had moved in 20 minutes, except for the moths batting themselves against the canopy lights outside. Tasha didn't mind the quiet. In fact, she preferred it. After years of barracks noise, orders barked before sunrise, and adrenaline-drenched deployments, stillness was something sacred. But stillness wasn't safety. She'd learned that too. She stood with weight evenly distributed between her heels, posture casual but precise. A practiced stillness. Her eyes swept over each corner of the store once more before returning to the door. Always the door. She didn't need to be here. Not really. But when Aunt Viola's hip replacement put her out for recovery, there was no question. Tasha had packed a duffel, kissed her apartment in Charleston goodbye for a few months, and come home. Back to Mason Pines, a place she hadn't seen since high school. A place that didn't feel like it missed her. The town itself hadn't changed much. Neither had the stairs. Tasha was used to that too. A black woman standing 6 feet tall in boots, built like a middleweight champion and carrying herself like she knew how to throw a man through a wall. Mason Pines wasn't used to women like her, and certainly not used to seeing one alone after dark. She moved behind the counter, fingers brushing the handle of the coffee pot before thinking better of it. It was already her 3rd cup. Instead, she leaned over the ledger and checked the inventory notes from earlier. Aunt Viola's handwriting, firm, looping cursive, covered the page with neat numbers and margin notes. Tasha smiled faintly. Her aunt may have been resting at home with a walker and doctor's orders to stay put, but her brain was still halfway in the gas station. A soft chime broke the air, the overhead bell at the far pump. Tasha's eyes flicked to the monitor again. Just a truck pulling in, headlights off, no movement yet. She didn't tense, not visibly. But something shifted behind her eyes. Mason Pines had its rhythms. Church crowds on Sunday. High schoolers loitering in summer. Hunters during deer season. And trouble after midnight. That's what Aunt Viola used to say, even before Tasha enlisted. "Tash, this place turns mean when the sun's gone," she once warned. "You don't have to look for trouble here. It finds you." She stepped out from behind the counter, calm and quiet, walking the aisles not because she needed to, but because she knew the store better when she moved through it. Her boots tapped lightly on the tiles. The security mirror above the refrigerated drinks gave her a full view of the front lot. The truck hadn't moved. Someone was still sitting inside, watching. She checked the time. 12:39 a.m. The hum of the cooler behind her seemed louder now. The flicker of the neon sign caught on a bottle of windshield wiper fluid, throwing red across the label like a warning. Tasha exhaled slowly and walked back to the front, her hand resting on the counter near the silent alarm. Just in case. Outside, the driver's side door opened. Whoever it was didn't step out right away. A boot hit the pavement. Then another. The door stayed open. Tasha didn't move. She watched. A tall, pale figure leaned against the frame, smoking. His posture wasn't lazy. It was too deliberate for that. He glanced at the building, then back toward the road. A second figure emerged from the passenger side, then two more from the back seat. 4 in total. They stood by the truck for a long moment, talking low, glancing at the storefront. One of them spat into the gravel. Another cracked his knuckles and smiled like he'd already won something. Tasha reached for her phone and texted Lena Hart. 4 outside. Watching. I'm good. Just saying. She set the phone down slowly. No panic. Just readiness. The bell above the door gave a lazy chime as the 4 figures stepped inside, the faint metallic sound barely cutting through the stagnant stillness of the night. Tasha didn't move from behind the counter. Her hands remained resting just beside the register, her expression unreadable as her eyes took them in. 4 white men, all under 30, all carrying themselves with the swagger of people who'd never once been told no, and didn't expect to hear it tonight. Their boots scuffed the tile with deliberate weight, and their glances skimmed the corners of the store not out of curiosity, but calculation, like they were counting exits and looking for weaknesses. The one in front, blonde and lanky with a thin, angular face, led the way with the kind of confidence that only ever came from being protected by history and hometowns. His denim jacket was worn just right, the collar turned up like he thought it made him look dangerous. He didn't speak at first, just walked straight up to the counter and leaned his elbow across the glass. Too close, too fast, making sure Tasha knew who was in control. Behind him, the other 3 fanned out casually. One with broad shoulders and a tattoo snaking down his neck moved toward the drinks cooler, popping his knuckles as he walked. Another, tall but hollow-eyed and jittery, drifted toward the snack aisle. The last, the youngest by a few years with a crooked lip ring and nervous hands, lingered closest to the door, glancing at the parking lot as if someone might be watching. Tasha tracked them all without turning her head, letting the camera monitor in her periphery do most of the work. She already knew what this was. The blonde cleared his throat and looked her up and down with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "Didn't think y'all had security this far out," he said, letting his voice drop into something mocking. "What's the story here? You moonlighting as a bouncer, or just trying to scare off the raccoons?" Tasha didn't blink. "I'm just filling in for my aunt while she recovers. Let me know if you need anything." He grinned at her professionalism like it was a joke. "That's so? Ain't that sweet? Must be tough, though, working out here this late all alone. You never know what kind of folks might wander in." From the back of the store, the one with the lip ring knocked a few bags of chips off the shelf with the back of his hand, then made a show of stepping on one as it crunched beneath his boot. "Oops!" he called out, snickering under his breath. Tasha's jaw didn't clench, but she let a breath slide slowly through her nose as she stepped out from behind the counter, broom already in hand. She didn't respond to the mockery. She didn't need to. Every inch of her posture said she'd seen worse men in worse places, and not a single one of them had walked away with what they came for. As she approached the chips, the man who had stepped on them refused to move, standing directly in her path. He didn't say anything at first, just watched her with a look that tried to be daring, but came off nervous. Finally, as she swept the crushed mess into the pan, he leaned in slightly, voice low enough to feign intimacy, but loud enough for the others to hear. "You know, you don't really belong in a place like this. Folks around here don't take kindly to outsiders playing hero." Tasha stood, looked him in the eye for a moment longer than comfort allowed, then stepped past him without giving the insult oxygen. The broom clicked softly against the base of the counter as she stowed it again, her movements smooth, intentional. But the moment she stepped behind the register, the blonde, still perched with one elbow across the glass, straightened suddenly and leaned forward. His hand shot out fast, faster than the others probably expected, gripping her by the collar just above her name tag, yanking her forward like he thought speed would give him leverage. It didn't. Tasha's right arm snapped up between his elbows, breaking his grip in a clean motion taught through muscle memory. Before he could react, she stepped inside his reach, rotated her hips, and drove an elbow into the center of his chest with a force that made him stumble backward and slam into the edge of a candy display. He gasped, stunned, but not unconscious, trying to regain balance, but she was already moving. The moment his back hit the candy rack, spilling wrappers and powdered sugar across the tile, the other three hesitated just a breath too long. And that was all the time Tasha needed. She stepped over the blonde without even glancing down, her boots catching on a scattered Snickers bar as she turned her full attention toward the broad-shouldered one moving in from the snack aisle. He muttered something under his breath, a slur she'd heard before in other places, in other tones, but this time it came with a swing. He barreled toward her, teeth bared and fists up like a prizefighter from some backwoods bar circuit. The kind of brute who assumed his size meant he couldn't lose. Tasha met him head-on. She dropped her weight low, ducked the first wild haymaker, and drove her shoulder into his midsection like a battering ram. The impact rattled the shelves and sent them both crashing into the end cap of windshield wipers and gum packs. He grunted, stunned, and she twisted her body hard to the right, slamming him shoulder first into the steel corner. The metal rattled, and his head bounced against the rack. But he recovered quicker than she expected, twisting in a grunt of rage and slamming his elbow against the back of her ribs. Pain bloomed instantly, sharp and bright, and for a moment she saw white. She gritted her teeth and spun around, catching a glimpse of his sneer before he charged again. This time he drove her into the side of the counter, knocking a rack of lighters to the floor with a clatter. Her breath caught in her chest. He tried to pin her with both arms, forearm pressing against her throat, breath hot and vile against her cheek as he leaned in. "Not so tough now, are you?" he growled. Her eyes stayed locked on his. Calm, cold, calculating. Then she shifted her hips. With one powerful twist, she brought her knee up and drove it straight into his thigh just above the knee, paralyzing his movement. As he buckled slightly, she hooked her arm under his and flipped him over her shoulder, sending him crashing hard onto his back. The impact rattled the floor. He groaned. The wind knocked completely from his lungs, his body twitching as he tried to rise again. She didn't give him the chance. One stomp. Center mass. He was out. But the moment she turned, the third one, tall and hollow-eyed, with twitchy hands and a chipped tooth, was already mid-sprint, flying at her with a long pipe wrench he must have grabbed from the tool rack by the cooler. She barely had time to shift. The wrench sliced past her ear with a metallic whistle, grazing her temple. The pain was instant and hot, a thin line of blood trickling down her cheek as she stumbled sideways, knocking into a rack of motor oil bottles that tumbled to the floor. He laughed, wild and high-pitched, eyes gleaming with something unhinged. "Got you now, girl," he spat, raising the wrench again, both hands tight on the handle. Tasha blinked the blood from her eye, adjusted her stance, and waited. He swung again. This time she ducked low, drove forward, and wrapped her arms around his waist, lifting him just enough to off-balance his swing. She slammed him into the fridge doors behind the drink cooler. The glass cracked, spider-webbing from the point of impact, and he dropped the wrench with a clatter. But he wasn't done. He clawed at her, punching blindly, catching her once on the shoulder, once near the jaw. The second hit staggered her, made her see black spots. She stumbled backward, breath ragged now, her ribs screaming from the earlier elbow. He lunged again, sloppier this time, overconfident. She pivoted, used his momentum, and sent him headfirst into the edge of the counter. His body folded on impact, slumping to the floor in a heap. 3 down. But the blonde was back on his feet. Blood from a cut above his eyebrow trickled down the side of his face, and his eyes had gone flat and hateful. He held a tire iron now, lifted from behind the counter, and he twirled it once in his hand, like he'd done this before. "You think you're something special?" he hissed. "Just because you got lucky with a few cowards? You're nothing but a mouthy mutt-playing soldier." Tasha rolled her neck slowly, flexed her bruised shoulder, and raised her hands. "I've been worse places than this," she said quietly. "Faced men stronger, smarter. You won't be the one to break me." He roared and charged. The first swing was high. She ducked under it and drove a punch into his ribs, but he was faster this time, recovering with a backhand that clipped the side of her face, splitting her lip. The iron came down again. She blocked it with both arms, the impact sending a jolt of pain through her elbows, but she didn't back down. She countered with a low kick to his shin, then a second punch that landed square on his throat. He choked, coughed, stumbled. She disarmed him in one clean motion, grabbing the tire iron and flinging it behind the counter. Then she stepped in, wrapped her arm around his neck from behind, and brought him down to the floor in a slow, controlled choke. He thrashed for a moment, gasping and sputtering, but she held firm. Not enough to kill, just enough to end it. When he stopped struggling, she let him drop. The store was silent. Tasha stood in the middle of it, sweat sliding down her neck, blood trickling from her split lip and temple, ribs aching with every breath, but standing. Her boots shifted slightly over broken glass and crushed bags of chips, the quiet hum of the cooler suddenly louder than it had ever been. The smell of blood and sweat clung to the air. One of the men groaned softly near the candy rack, curled on his side. Another was unconscious near the register, mouth open, blood smeared beneath him. The third coughed, spitting something dark onto the floor as he struggled to sit up, with one arm hanging limp at his side. She didn't look at them. She didn't need to. They weren't a threat anymore. The bell above the door jingled again, and the sudden wash of red and blue flooded across the front windows, painting the scene in stuttering pulses. Officer Lena Hart moved in first, her hand near her holstered weapon but not drawn, eyes sweeping the store with sharp, immediate calculation. Her gaze landed on the carnage, then on Tasha, bloodied, breathing hard, but entirely composed. "Tasha!" Lena's voice was low and careful, not in fear, but in understanding. "You all right?" Tasha nodded once. 3 down, 1 ran. Truck. White Ford, no plates. He peeled out south. Behind Lena, Deputy Roland Price stepped in, his hand on his belt, eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. His mouth turned down at the corners before he even said a word. "Looks like a hurricane hit this place. What the hell happened?" "They attacked me," Tasha answered, voice even, slow. "Security footage will show the rest. I told them to leave. They didn't." Lena had already moved behind the counter, tapping the store's terminal, pulling up the feed from the cameras. Tasha didn't need to say anything else. The footage would confirm everything. The entrance, the harassment, the moment the blonde one grabbed her by the collar, every strike, every fall, every time she held back when she could have gone further. It was all there. The truth didn't need commentary. Price glanced at the bodies again. "And you're saying you did all this by yourself?" "I defended myself," Tasha replied. "No more, no less." He gave a low whistle under his breath, folding his arms across his chest. "That's some defense." Lena glanced over her shoulder, her voice sharp. "Roland, I'm just saying," he muttered, though quieter now. 3 men on the floor, and she's just standing there. You don't find that suspicious?" "She's a combat vet," Lena said, still watching the footage. "Special Forces instructor. She could have killed them if she wanted. She didn't." Tasha didn't move. She didn't need to defend herself. The proof was on screen, the swelling on her face, the bruises already forming along her ribs. Her restraint was the only reason anyone was breathing. Minutes later, paramedics arrived. One of the men was still unconscious. Another begged for something for the pain. The third, blonde, furious, trying to hide the tremor in his hands, refused to look at her as they loaded him onto the gurney. The moment his eyes met hers, he flinched. Tasha gave her full statement in the back of Lena's cruiser. Her voice was calm, measured. She answered every question with precision. Not emotion. No anger. Just facts. It was all muscle memory at this point. Observe, assess, report. Even now, blood still drying on her lip, she carried herself with the stillness of someone who'd been through worse in places no camera had ever reached. Deputy Price hovered nearby, but kept his distance. The way Lena took Tasha's word without pressing, the way she handled the evidence, it was clear who believed her and who didn't. But belief wasn't required. Proof was. When the last ambulance pulled away and the sun began to touch the treetops with a dull gray light, Lena returned Tasha's phone and nodded once. "You did good," she said. "I'll walk you through filing the charges once you're cleaned up." "I'm fine," Tasha said automatically, then caught herself. She wasn't. Not completely. Her ribs were on fire, her face ached, and she was starting to feel every hit she'd absorbed now that the adrenaline was draining away. "Go to urgent care," Lena said, reading it on her face. "Get checked. I'll have someone guard the station till daylight. We've got enough here for 3 solid arrests. No one's walking away from this clean." Tasha nodded. But even as she stepped into her truck, even as she drove to the clinic, she couldn't shake the feeling in her chest. Not fear, not pain, but something colder. Unfinished. She didn't sleep that morning, not with ice pressed to her ribs. Not after the local news posted the story. Veteran store clerk defends herself in brutal late-night attack. The headline was picked up by a bigger outlet before she even took a second shower. By afternoon, the video footage, posted from a police leak probably, had been clipped, edited, memed, hashtagged, and shared 1,000,000 times. The views climbed. The comments poured in. Some hailed her as a hero. Others questioned her restraint. A few, angry, small-minded voices, accused her of being exactly what those men claimed she was. She ignored them all. Tasha had seen what fame did to people. She didn't want her face on shirts or signs. She didn't need recognition. She'd done what was necessary, the way she always had. But somewhere else, in a dim, quiet room lined with tools and peeling drywall, Jace Monroe watched the footage on repeat, eyes bloodshot and jaw clenched tight. The cut where his lip ring had torn free was crusted over now, the bruise on his jaw yellowing at the edge. He didn't blink as he watched her elbow drop one of his boys. He didn't speak as she dropped the third. He didn't flinch as the comments scrolled past on his cracked phone screen, each one a digital humiliation. He watched her face freeze on the final frame. Calm, resolute, standing above the mess they made. Then he scrawled something on the wall in black marker. "She don't get to win." And beneath it, "We're not done." The sun had barely climbed over the treetops when Tasha pulled into the lot, her body stiff from a night of restless half-sleep and pain that pulsed steadily beneath the tight compression of bandages around her ribs. She stepped out of her truck with slow control, not because she was uncertain, but because pain had a way of demanding respect when it settled deep in the bone. The cool morning air brushed against her skin, but it wasn't the weather that made her pause before unlocking the door. It was the sight of the back wall. The first thing she saw was the dripping black paint. Thick strokes sprayed across the faded siding with hurried aggression but unmistakable intent. The words were uneven, letters leaning and colliding like they had been scrawled in fury more than precision, but they were readable from 20 yards away. "We coming for you, Tasha." Her name, painted in capitals with jagged lines that clawed across the surface, sat like a threat carved in tar. Beneath the message, someone had attempted to draw a symbol, crudely shaped, deliberately chilling, a distorted noose, slashed across the bottom with red paint that bled down in thin trails like a wound that hadn't closed. Tasha stood still, the keys in her hand pressed tight into her palm as she stared at the wall, her breathing steady even as something in her chest began to lock into place. There was no question about the message. It wasn't a warning. It was a challenge, a promise, and she had no intention of running from it. The back door creaked open under her touch, and the interior lights flickered on to reveal the store unchanged from the day before. Aisles in order, counters clean, everything reset to its usual quiet, orderly rhythm. But the order didn't comfort her. It only made the mark outside feel more invasive, like they had violated the one place that had remained untouched. The attack from days earlier had been physical, brutal, a clash of bodies and rage. This was different. It was psychological. A reminder that they still believed they had power, that they could own the night if they wanted to. But they were wrong. When Aunt Viola arrived later that morning, moving carefully with her cane and wrapped in the warmth of a knitted shawl she wore even in the spring heat, she froze in place the moment she saw the back wall. Her lips parted slightly, her voice catching as she took it in. "Lord," she whispered, one hand rising to her chest, her fingers curling slightly around the base of her throat. Are they threatening you?" Tasha stood a few feet away, arms crossed and jaw set, her expression unreadable but her eyes sharper than usual. She didn't respond immediately, and when she did, her voice came out lower than usual, as if forged from something too old and heavy to lift easily. "They're trying to remind me I embarrassed them. They want to make me feel small, unsafe. But they should have thought of that before they came through that door." Viola turned toward her with something between concern and maternal instinct rising in her gaze. "You already handled them, baby. The whole town's seen it. The police got them locked up. What more can you do? Let the system work." Tasha didn't laugh, but the smile that crossed her face was colder than the morning air. "The system showed up 10 minutes after it was over. That wall didn't paint itself last night, and I don't plan to be caught reacting again." Viola shook her head slowly. "You can't live waiting for them to come back." Tasha met her eyes then, voice calm but unyielding. "I'm not waiting for them. I'm preparing for them." That afternoon, while the regular customers trickled through, locals who avoided mentioning the viral video but whose glances stayed longer than necessary, Tasha began upgrading the security system. She didn't call in professionals. She didn't need to. Her time in the army had taught her more than how to fight. She knew how to fortify a location, how to anticipate movement, and how to record it without anyone knowing it was being done. She installed 4 new cameras, each with high-resolution infrared, mounted in places that wouldn't be noticed at first glance. One watched the back wall. Another monitored the alley beside the station. 2 more kept silent vigil over the front lot and the entrance. All of them fed directly into her phone in real time, backed up to cloud storage and encrypted drives. She also rewired the breaker box, added a second silent alarm with a direct signal to Officer Lena Hart's personal number, and ran cable to a battery-powered emergency system that would keep the cameras running even if the station's power was cut. Every detail was accounted for. No more reacting, no more guessing. The next time they came, she'd be watching before they even reached the building. Later that night, while reviewing the previous day's footage to test the motion capture function, Tasha caught something she didn't expect. A grainy infrared frame just past 2:14 a.m. From the back alley, cam showed 2 trucks pulling up in tandem, both dark, unmarked, with their plates deliberately removed. 6 figures stepped out. 5 young men, one familiar shape leading them. Even in low light, there was no mistaking the stride, the posture, or the way he stood slightly apart from the others, pointing, instructing, commanding. Jace Monroe. He wasn't hiding anymore. In fact, the way he moved told her he wanted her to know it was him. She watched as he led the new group around the edge of the station, directing them like a man assigning tasks. One of them sprayed more graffiti on the wall. Another shattered the security light above the dumpster. But they didn't try to enter. Not yet. It was a rehearsal. A message. They were getting organized. And this time, it wasn't just revenge. It was preparation. Tasha let the footage roll, her eyes narrowing as each frame confirmed what she already knew. They weren't just coming back for pride. They were coming back for her. And if they were getting ready, then so was she. The days that followed moved slower than they should have. The station opened and closed on schedule. Customers came and went with their usual small talk and cautious stares, and everything outwardly appeared unchanged. But beneath the surface of the routine, Tasha was building something methodical and unspoken. Every spare hour, every sliver of time when the pumps were quiet and the front lot sat empty, she used for preparation, not in panic or paranoia, but in the exact, efficient way she'd once trained new recruits overseas, back when survival depended on seeing what others didn't. Behind the station, where the pine trees crept in close and the back lot met the gravel edge of the woods, Tasha laid out a training circuit. The area had once stored empty crates and bulk deliveries, but now it became her domain. She marked distances with broken pallets and used old tires to create movement drills that mimicked corner rushes and blind encounters. Each morning, before customers arrived and the world remembered her name, she ran through repetitions, striking the air, rolling through impact drills, practicing disarms with a dull practice blade wrapped in duct tape. Her ribs still ached, but she trained around the pain, adjusting angles and lowering her center of gravity to reduce strain. Pain wasn't a hindrance anymore. It was information. It taught her what her body could still do when pushed, and what adjustments were needed to fight through fatigue. She knew she wouldn't have the element of surprise again. They'd come with numbers, with anger, maybe even with weapons they hadn't dared show the first time. But numbers meant nothing if they were disorganized, and rage didn't land clean punches. Strategy did. She walked the property like she was tracing the blueprint of a battlefield. She counted paces from the rear exit to the edge of the fence line. She tested how far voices carried between the alley and the ice machine. She mapped the blind spots left by the overhead lights and corrected them, not by adding more visibility, but by turning those shadows into controlled space. She used an old crowbar to create pressure point levers hidden behind crates. She wrapped lengths of rubber tubing around pipe ends to turn them into quick grappling weapons, the kind that could disarm or disable without requiring lethal force. Her army kit had long been locked away in her truck's toolbox, but now she opened it and pulled what she needed: compression wraps, reinforced gloves, a tactical belt she'd customized years ago. Every inch of the station, from the back fence to the soda fridge, became part of her plan. Nothing was left to chance. One afternoon, as the sun burned low over the tree line and shadows crept long across the gravel, Tasha stood in the dirt yard behind the station with a sweat-soaked shirt clinging to her spine and her fists taped with weathered gauze. She had just completed her 4th rotation of movement drills, breathing hard but steady, when Aunt Viola's voice floated through the open back door. "Tasha," she called, her tone softer than usual but edged with worry. "You sure this is the right way to handle it?" Tasha didn't turn around at first. She picked up her water bottle, took a measured sip, and wiped her forehead with the inside of her arm. When she did face her aunt, her expression was calm, but her eyes gave away the weight of the decision she had already made. "They're not just angry anymore," Tasha said, her voice low but resolute. "They're planning something. That footage wasn't just vandalism, it was rehearsal. He's recruiting. Jace isn't coming back with just the same boys. He's coming back with numbers, with a plan. So I need one too." Viola stepped down onto the gravel, her cane steadying her as she walked slowly forward. "Then we call the police again. We tell Lena. Let her handle it with backup and warrants and whatever they do. I already told her what I saw. I sent her the footage, but she can't move on it yet. Not without a warrant, not without another incident. And they know that. That's why they're waiting. They're baiting me, testing how far they can go before someone stops them." Viola's eyes narrowed with concern. "So you're going to fight them again? Alone?" "I'm going to end it. Not because I want to, but because I know what happens if I don't." That evening, Tasha loaded Viola's overnight bag into the back of a neighbor's car, a retired schoolteacher named Miss Evelyn, who lived 5 miles down the road and had a sturdy house with cameras and a reinforced door installed by her late husband. Viola didn't argue. Not because she agreed, but because she knew that once her niece made a decision, there was no prying her from it. As the car rolled down the gravel drive and disappeared past the edge of the trees, Tasha stood in the lot alone, the last light of day cutting across the station's roof like a final warning. Later that night, Lena pulled up unannounced, headlights off, her cruiser barely making a sound as it coasted to a stop by the pumps. Tasha had seen her coming long before the tires touched the gravel, another advantage of positioning, of awareness. She stepped out from the side of the building, arms folded, her hoodie zipped to the neck, her hands still wrapped in tape from that evening's drills. Lena didn't bother with small talk. "You're planning something," she said. "I saw the camera placements on the footage you sent. I saw the way you're moving in those angles. You're not just watching for them. You're setting them up." Tasha nodded, unbothered. "I'm not going to sit here waiting for someone else to clean up this mess. They're not just some wannabe gang. They're organized now. Jace is playing chess, and I'm not letting him make the next move." "You know how this looks," Lena warned, stepping closer. "If something goes wrong, if someone gets hurt, they'll say you escalated it. Doesn't matter what the footage shows. You're already the headline. You think they won't flip it again?" "I'm not trying to be a hero," Tasha said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm trying to stop a war before it starts." Lena stared at her for a long moment, the silence between them filled with old understanding and new fear. Then, with a reluctant sigh, she opened the door of her cruiser and handed Tasha a second burner phone. "If it goes sideways," she said, You call me. Direct. No radio chatter, no dispatch. Just me. Tasha accepted the phone without hesitation. The sun had set. The night had begun. And so had the countdown. The wind had dropped to nothing by the time the clock crept past 2:10 a.m., leaving the air still and suffocating with tension. A low mist had started to form near the tree line beyond the gas station, blurring the edges of the gravel lot and making every distant shape seem more alive than it was. Tasha sat in darkness just behind the stockroom door, crouched low beside the water heater, her eyes trained on the small phone screen in her hand. The feed showed everything in real time: the front pump, the alley, the back wall. Motion sensors were armed. Surveillance was synced. Every camera caught the moment the two black pickup trucks pulled into the lot, their headlights off, their engines quiet as breath. 6 figures climbed out. 5 wore dark hoodies and cloth masks pulled over their faces, hands gloved, posture aggressive. The 6th walked behind them, head uncovered, his blonde hair cropped shorter than before, his expression unreadable beneath the weight of command. Even in the low light, there was no mistaking who it was. Jace Monroe hadn't come to scare her. He'd come to finish what he started, and this time he brought a small army. They moved quickly, but without discipline, confident in numbers, confident in the mask of night. One broke off toward the alley. Another hung back near the far pump as lookout. The other 3 advanced toward the back door, one gripping bolt cutters, the other 2 carrying blunt weapons, one a metal pipe, the other a crowbar worn with rust. They hadn't come for graffiti. They had come for blood. Tasha didn't move. She didn't breathe deep. She waited. The first one reached the service door and tried the handle. Locked. He stepped back. The moment his foot touched the outer perimeter line Tasha had marked earlier that day, taped invisible across the top step beneath the overhang, the lights snapped on. A flood of white light exploded across the back of the building, powered by concealed halogen beams mounted in the eaves, and for one full second, every man in the lot froze in the glare like cornered prey. Their shadows stretched long and distorted behind them. Their formation broke instantly. One staggered back into the alley. Another cursed and dropped the crowbar with a clang. The silence they'd arrived in was shattered. Tasha moved before any of them could. She pushed through the side stockroom door, emerging from the blind spot with practiced, calculated speed. Her boots didn't hesitate as she sprinted the 10 paces to the nearest man, the one with the pipe, who had just begun to recover from the shock. She struck low and fast, aiming her first blow at the side of his knee, folding his stance instantly. As he fell sideways, she followed with a second strike to the ribs with the short baton she carried, a modified training weapon she'd weighted herself. He screamed once before crumpling. The second man turned at the sound, pipe raised high in panic rather than strategy, and she charged before he could swing. Her shoulder collided with his chest, and she used the momentum to drive him backward into the side of the truck. His head hit the frame with a dull thud, and she pulled back just enough to drive her elbow into his jaw, snapping it sideways. He collapsed without ceremony. Behind her, someone yelled, "Too late." Tasha spun to find the third one, the tallest, lunging from behind the stack of pallets near the dumpster, a short chain swinging wildly in his hands. He brought it down with full force. She ducked, felt the air shift just inches above her, then surged upward with a strike to his midsection that doubled him over. She grabbed his hood, yanked him off balance, and dragged him to the ground in a controlled sweep, locking his arm behind him and wrenching until he went limp. 3 down. The fourth emerged from the alley, smaller, quicker, clearly younger, and froze when he saw what had become of the others. For half a second, his legs twitched as if debating whether to attack or retreat, but the decision came quickly. He turned and ran. Tasha didn't chase. Not yet. She turned back toward the pump station, watching the last masked man raise a pistol, not at her, but in the air. A threat, a bluff, or worse, a signal. His hand trembled. She stepped forward slowly, body angled, heart pounding beneath her bruised ribs. She raised her hands, not in surrender, but in focus. "Drop it," she called out, her voice level, powerful. "You're not ready for what happens next." He hesitated, blinked, and ran. Tasha sprinted after him. She moved with the same fluid intensity that had once earned her medals in the desert. Her body screamed with pain, but her mind was fire. She chased him through the side lot, over the concrete divider, across the gravel toward the abandoned storage warehouse that loomed just past the trees. He was fast, but she was faster. Every step narrowed the gap. He darted through a broken side gate and toward the maintenance ladder at the back of the structure. As he climbed, she recognized the way he moved, the tension in the shoulders, the calculated pauses. This wasn't a recruit. This was Jace. She stopped at the base of the ladder, looked up at the roof line where his silhouette paused. "You don't have to do this," she said, breath ragged but even. "It's already over." From above, his voice came down cold and clear. "Not until you're beneath me." Then he disappeared over the edge. Tasha climbed after him, slow and deliberate, her hands flexing on the rungs, every breath measuring the moment before the final confrontation. She reached the top and stepped into the dark. The rooftop was wide and scattered with gravel, its surface uneven and broken in places where the old tar had cracked under years of sun and neglect. A dim floodlight from a distant pole cast just enough glow to define the edge of the roofline, leaving the center cloaked in shifting shadow. Tasha pulled herself over the final rung and rose slowly, eyes adjusting, ears tuned to every crunch of loose stone beneath her boots. Jace stood about 10 feet away, breathing hard, arms loose at his sides, his expression somewhere between amusement and contempt. The skin around his lip was still dark and raw, where the ring had torn free, and when he spoke, he favored one side, as if the wound still burned beneath his words. He paced slowly in a wide arc, sizing her up like a man who thought he'd already won, who believed the outcome was written because of the mask he wore behind his smirk. "So, this is it?" he called out, voice taunting. "All that training, all that buzz about you, MMA champ, Army tough girl. I came all this way to see it, and you're standing there like you're scared to move." Tasha's stance remained steady, her posture lowered slightly, her left foot angled just ahead, weight balanced. She watched his movement, not his mouth. His hips told her more than his words ever could. "You want a show?" she said calmly, her voice low, almost bored. "Then step up." Jace laughed once, sharp and ugly. "You think just 'cause you laid out a couple boys with more mouth than brains, that makes you something special?" He squared his shoulders and lunged forward without warning, leading with a wild right hook meant to knock her off her feet. Tasha ducked beneath the arc of his swing, pivoted on her back foot, and drove a quick, precise left jab into his ribs. The strike wasn't meant to drop him, just to test range. She followed it with a rear leg low kick to his thigh that buckled his stance for a half step. Jace recovered fast, grunted, and swung again, this time aiming lower, catching her with a glancing blow across the ribs that sent pain blooming through the bruises. She hadn't had time to rest. She stepped back, exhaled slowly, and reset. He came at her again, sloppier now, his footwork betraying frustration. She parried his next jab, slid into a clinch, and drove a sharp knee into his stomach, before twisting out of the tie-up and creating space. He stumbled, gasped, but didn't fall. "You're not even that fast," he spat, wiping at his lip, which now bled at the corner. "All hype." Tasha rolled her neck, flexed her gloved fingers. "Then stop running your mouth and test me properly." That got under his skin. He charged again, this time trying to wrestle her to the ground with brute strength, arms wrapping around her torso in a takedown attempt. She lowered her base, spread her stance, and resisted the drag. Using his momentum, she pivoted and executed a textbook sprawl, her weight pressing down on his back, then twisted into a side control that ended with her elbow hammering down toward his shoulder. He shoved her off with a desperate surge, both of them rolling across the rooftop gravel. Tasha felt the scrape tear at her forearm, the sting sharp and immediate, but she ignored it. She was already rising, legs beneath her, posture restored. Jace came in again, slower now, breathing ragged, and tried to fake left before throwing a knee. She caught it, wrapped her arm around his leg mid-strike, lifted with a hip turn, and slammed him backward onto the roof. The impact rattled the loose gravel beneath them. She followed with a mounted position, one knee pinning his midsection, the other raised for balance. He threw a wild hook from beneath her, caught her across the cheek. Her vision sparked white. She tasted blood. But it wasn't enough. She drove a right cross into his jaw. His head snapped back. Another blow, this time a hook across his temple. Jace groaned, tried to shove her off again, but she adjusted, locked her legs around his arm, and flipped him into a tight triangle choke from the ground. His free hand clawed at her thigh, his breath rasping louder with every second as she tightened the hold, her body weight cinching around his neck like a noose. His fingers scraped uselessly at her leg, each movement growing more desperate, more ragged, as the triangle choke closed around him like a steel trap. Tasha's thighs pressed against either side of his neck with brutal precision, cutting off blood flow and collapsing his airway with the relentless pressure of someone who knew exactly how long a body could resist before failing. His free hand thudded against her side, wild, unfocused, but filled with the flailing violence of a man refusing to accept the inevitability of defeat. He twisted his hips, arching hard to dislodge her, his boots grinding against the gravel as he tried to roll them both into a break. She adjusted seamlessly, shifting her weight to seal the hold tighter, her ankles locked behind his shoulder blades, her arms braced against the rooftop surface to maintain balance. His breaths came faster now, sharper and more shallow, the panic beginning to replace arrogance. His lips curled in a snarl, but the sound he tried to make emerged as a strangled gasp instead. "You wanted to see if I was really a fighter?" she growled, her voice strained but steady as her legs flexed tighter, her body coiled with the intensity of someone who had been underestimated one time too many. This is what championship looks like. Just as his strength seemed to wane, his hand reached lower and jabbed hard into her side with the sharp edge of something he'd kept tucked in his waistband. A broken piece of metal, small and rusted, but pointed enough to dig into the bruised ribs she had taken hits on earlier. The pain exploded through her side like fire. Her grip faltered for the first time, her body recoiling just enough for Jace to twist again, and with a furious grunt, he managed to break the choke, flinging his weight sideways and rolling them apart across the rooftop's gravel-slick surface. She landed hard on her back, the air punching from her lungs as the pain in her side screamed, raw and piercing. She tried to rise, but Jace was already moving. Blood poured from his nose, one eye nearly swollen shut. But he came for her with the single-minded rage of a man who no longer cared about control. He tackled her before she could fully recover, his shoulder driving into her abdomen, sending another jolt of pain through her ribs as they hit the rooftop together. This time, he landed on top. His fists flew, one after the other, clumsy but filled with power and fury. The first blow connected with the side of her jaw, snapping her head back. The second hit her shoulder. The third caught her temple, a flash of white streaking across her vision as she reached up and grabbed his wrist mid-strike, wrenching it outward while twisting her hips beneath him. He tried to pin her again, but she kicked upward, her shin striking his thigh, knocking him off balance just enough for her to swing her leg over and flip them, reversing their positions with pure technique. Now on top, she didn't rush the advantage. She straddled his torso and drove her forearm against his throat, pressing him flat while blood trickled from the corner of her mouth and dripped down onto his chest. He growled beneath her, his arms flailing, his hands clawing for purchase, but she blocked each attempt with swift, brutal counters. He grabbed at her hoodie, pulled hard, and threw her sideways. They rolled again, a tangle of limbs, the gravel scraping into their skin, cutting shallow trails along her forearm and his cheek. He was stronger than he looked, and every time he connected, the pain multiplied. An elbow that slammed into her injured side, a knee that caught the inside of her thigh. She grunted, her breath ragged, the ache in her ribs now burning hot and constant. But she didn't back off. She stepped inside his next swing, grabbed his forearm, and dragged it downward, locking his shoulder with a standing kimura grip that wrenched his body toward the edge of the roof. He screamed, tried to twist out, but she pivoted behind him, swept his legs from beneath him, and brought him crashing down onto the gravel once more. This time, she didn't go for a hold. She straddled his chest again, pinning both his wrists to the ground with her knees. His face was bruised and bloodied, rage still burning in the one eye that wasn't swollen shut, his mouth pulling into a hateful sneer. "You think you win just 'cause you're stronger now?" he rasped, coughing blood. "You think this changes anything?" Tasha didn't respond with words. She reared back and delivered a sharp, clean elbow across his cheekbone, watching his head whip to the side, then immediately followed with another strike to the opposite temple. His body jerked. His mouth opened in a shocked breath. She struck a third time, measured, controlled, final. His head hit the roof with a dull, hollow thud, and then he stopped moving. His chest still rose and fell. He was alive, but the fire behind his eyes, the hate, the pride, the conviction, was gone. Whatever plan he had carried onto that rooftop had died there with his final swing. Tasha staggered to her feet, trembling now not from fear, but from exertion, her muscles screaming with fatigue, her face wet with sweat and blood, and the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders like armor. Tasha stood over Jace's unconscious body as the rooftop lights pulsed gently behind her, their steady flicker matching the throb in her bruised ribs. Her chest rose and fell with effort, her knuckles still swollen, blood dried along her jawline and brow. Gravel clung to her hoodie and scraped along her forearms where the skin had split. But none of it mattered in that moment. The fight was done. The damage delivered. The silence that followed wasn't relief. It was responsibility. She reached for her phone, still strapped to her chest beneath her jacket, and tapped the camera icon. The screen lit her face faintly in the night, catching the raw truth in her expression. Pain, fatigue, determination. She turned the lens slowly, panning over the rooftop, showing each man where they had fallen. Jace lay at her feet, one arm twisted awkwardly beneath him, his face swollen and slack. She didn't add commentary. She didn't need to. The truth was etched in blood, in the positions of the bodies, in the effort it had taken to stay standing. "This is Tasha Daniels," she said, her voice low but clear, every word deliberate. 6 men attacked my aunt's station tonight. I've incapacitated 4. 1 escaped. I am unharmed but injured. This was not a mistake. This was retaliation. You'll find the evidence in the footage, the rooftop, and in their truck parked behind the building. I need backup. I need medical. I'll hold position until you arrive. She ended the recording and immediately attached the video clips, both her own and the live security feed she had saved from earlier, and sent them to Lena Hart's direct number. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from exhaustion, the weight of every blow beginning to register now that the adrenaline was draining from her system. When the reply came, it was short but precise. On the way. Stay where you are. Tasha pocketed the phone and finally let her legs bend beneath her, sitting against the rusted lip of the rooftop with her arms resting over her knees. Below, the cruiser doors slammed open, and Lena's voice barked orders with that clipped efficiency Tasha had always respected. Within moments, the scene below shifted into motion. Uniforms fanning out, guns drawn but low, Lena's flashlight cutting arcs along the building's edge. The rest of the gang had been restrained by the time they reached the lot. Not one had made it past the lights. By sunrise, the back lot of the station had transformed into a full operation. Evidence markers were planted near bloodstains and weapons. The trucks were impounded, their contents photographed, logged, and secured. Medical personnel tended to the gang members, treating wounds with just enough care to ensure they'd live long enough to face charges. Jace, still unconscious, was stretchered out under watch. Lena didn't say much when she climbed the fire escape to the roof. She found Tasha still seated, her breathing steadier, her eyes distant. Lena knelt beside her, not like a cop, but like someone who had waited far too long to see the truth come full circle. "I saw the footage," she said. "It's clear. You held back. You gave them chances. You didn't escalate." Tasha looked at her without blinking. "Didn't need to. They were looking for punishment. I just gave them the mirror." Lena studied her for a moment longer, then offered a hand, helping her to her feet. "Ambulance is waiting. I'll ride with you." "No," Tasha said, wincing as she stood. "They need you here. There's more to this." And she was right. An hour later, after medical staff had checked her for a cracked rib and patched the deep scrape along her arm, Lena returned to the station to find a commotion unfolding near the far side of the lot. Officers had begun sweeping the warehouse next door, the one Tasha had chased Jace around, the one none of them had thought to question before. Inside, they found maps, notes, a half-burned notebook with times, names, and coordinates, scrawled diagrams of the gas station layout, pictures, grainy cell phone stills of Tasha taken from a distance in the days leading up to the second attack. It hadn't been random. It had been organized. The raid that followed later that evening led to the arrest of 2 more men hiding in a nearby shed less than 2 miles away. One of them, an ex-con with ties to a white nationalist militia group, the other with weapons charges pending in a different county. Guns were seized, radios, spare phones with encrypted apps Tasha didn't recognize, but knew meant planning. Deputy Price, who had insisted from the beginning that Tasha was overreacting, stood beside Lena that afternoon while the last of the warehouse items were logged. He hadn't said much during the past hour. Now, as he glanced at the wall of pictures and handwritten surveillance notes pinned over crates of illegal ammo, he cleared his throat awkwardly. "I didn't think it was this serious," he muttered. Lena didn't look at him. "You didn't think she could be right. I was wrong," he admitted, softer. Lena turned her head then, met his eyes with that sharp, surgical calm she used when words had to cut. "She nearly died because you waited for the system to work the way it never has for people like her. You're lucky she's standing at all." Price looked away, shame raw on his face. But as the last evidence bag was sealed and the scene began to wind down, no one noticed the unmarked sedan parked across the road beneath the shadow of a tall pine, its windows tinted dark, engine idling with patience. Inside, a man sat alone, his eyes locked on the station, his phone open to a paused security feed, the same footage Tasha had recorded, pulled not from social media, but from the original cloud upload before it was officially entered into evidence. Within 48 hours, Tasha's face had been broadcast on every major network, posted in digital news feeds, clipped into viral reels, and framed with captions ranging from "Veteran Hero" to "Guardian of Mason Pines." The video of the rooftop fight, leaked from a bystander's phone, likely someone from the emergency response team, was already circulating by the time the official statement was drafted. And once the unedited security footage followed, showing the gang's coordinated attack and Tasha's unflinching, brutal defense, the story took on a life of its own. News anchors praised her calm under pressure. Military veterans applauded her tactical control. Women's organizations began referencing her as a modern symbol of resilience, of self-defense done right. A handful of martial arts gyms even used stills of the rooftop triangle choke as promotional material, citing her control and form. Some platforms called her the embodiment of tactical grace. Others simply said she did what anyone in her position should have done, and what so few could have survived. But Tasha wanted no part of it. She refused almost every interview, declining cable news appearances and feature spreads in glossy magazines. She turned down invitations to speak at panels, to appear on podcasts, to attend fundraisers built around her story. When a documentary team offered to come to Mason Pines to film a dramatized retelling of the fight, she ignored the email entirely. She wasn't interested in spectacle. She had done what was necessary. She had survived. And for her, that was enough. But the world didn't stop. Social media carried the weight of the story forward whether she participated or not. And soon, others, online researchers, independent investigators, civilian sleuths with too much time and very sharp eyes, began digging through the details. Names from the arrest records were posted, faces identified, criminal histories pieced together from scattered county logs and court databases. At first, it all seemed straightforward. A group of white men with records of minor violence, local harassment, trespassing, drunk and disorderly conduct, nothing that hadn't been seen before. But then came the anomalies. One user, a data analyst who worked in cybersecurity by day, pointed out that several members of the gang, especially Jace and two of the others, had arrest records that disappeared shortly after booking. Public databases showed gaps. Charges filed, but no outcome. Complaints logged, but no trial. In several cases, the dates aligned with periods of employment at private security firms operating along the southern border or embedded in overseas contracts under third-party defense operations. Another Reddit thread traced the older brother of one of the gang members to a former employee of a security outfit known as Perimeter West, a now-defunct firm that had once operated out of Nevada, quietly absorbed into a larger conglomerate tied to private military consulting. That same user posted screenshots from a now-deleted Facebook group where former Perimeter West employees discussed retraining programs for rural defense and referenced a list of candidates considered ideologically aligned. The words were vague, but the implications weren't. This wasn't just a group of backwoods punks with a grudge. There was structure behind them. There was training. There was recruitment. And someone had been clearing their records along the way. Officer Lena Hart had noticed it too. While processing the paperwork for the post-raid arrest files, she found inconsistencies that made her stomach turn. She'd been an officer long enough to know that every arrest had a paper trail, whether dropped, dismissed, or otherwise, and yet some of the names connected to the warehouse evidence had redacted entries or outdated warrants that no longer showed in the system. One man had been arrested for illegal weapons possession in Georgia, only to be released without formal charges the next day. Another had been connected to a hate group in Montana, but no official watch list ever marked him. It didn't add up. She sat in the precinct's back office late one evening, the glare from the monitor washing over her face as she compared files side by side. Redactions. Missing case numbers. No follow-up investigations. When she tried to call in a favor from an old friend in records over in Houston, he told her plainly, "These names have flags above my clearance level. I don't know what they're tied to, but someone bigger has their hands in this." She didn't like it, and she knew Tasha wouldn't either. The next morning, Lena drove to the gas station. The lot was quiet, the paint still faded where the graffiti had been power-washed off, but the station looked intact, still standing, still working, just like the woman inside. Tasha was behind the counter, going through invoices and shipment receipts, her bandaged arm moving stiffly but without hesitation. Her face was less bruised now, but her eyes remained the same. Steady, alert, always reading ahead. Lena stepped in, removed her sunglasses, and dropped a thin folder on the counter. Tasha glanced at it, then back at her. "What am I looking at?" she asked, not breaking rhythm as she signed a form. Redacted records. Men with backgrounds that were wiped clean. Affiliations with a private security network that hasn't officially existed in 3 years. And court documents that disappeared somewhere between county and federal levels. Tasha paused. She set her pen down carefully. "And you're telling me this wasn't just some angry locals with too much time and hate in their guts?" Lena shook her head. "I'm telling you, this goes higher than that. Someone's been protecting them. Someone wanted them trained, armed, and angry." Tasha didn't flinch. "Then it's not over." "No," Lena agreed. "It's not." And neither of them noticed the email that arrived 30 seconds later, in the inbox of a regional bureau office, flagged and encrypted, containing a screen capture from a parked car across from the gas station. The image showed Lena and Tasha, mid-conversation, unaware they were being watched again. The subject line read, "She's adapting. We escalate." It was nearing dusk when Lena Hart returned to the precinct archives, a manila folder tucked under one arm and her phone still buzzing with messages from the State Bureau, each one more delayed and non-committal than the last. She had spent the better part of the afternoon re-reviewing every file from the recent raid, every piece of intel retrieved from the warehouse adjacent to Viola's gas station, and what she had begun to uncover no longer pointed to coincidence or criminal stupidity. It pointed to coordination, and something colder beneath it. She stepped into the records room and dropped the folder on the desk, flipping it open with quick fingers. The name at the top of the document glared back at her. Wesley Caro, age 39. Dishonorably discharged. Last known employment listed as field trainer, overseas protective detail. Officially, he was a nobody, but his old security clearance flagged her access attempt. The redacted sections in his file were typical of private military contractors: classified details, oversight omissions, a trail of vanishing employers. But one entry stood out. Colburn Security Group, Contractor ID Bravo 769B 241, decommissioned 3 years ago after internal misconduct and a quietly resolved civilian casualty scandal. Colburn Security had once operated alongside U.S. military units in Iraq during the height of the insurgency. On paper, they were embedded for infrastructure security and logistics escort. Off the record, they were notorious for aggression, corruption, and black market arms handling. They had never been fully exposed, only relocated, renamed, or absorbed into other networks. And buried inside Wesley Caro's personnel file was a notation that chilled Lena the moment she read it. Prior affiliation. Perimeter West. 2009-2012. Tactical Training Division. Tier 2 assessment. She leaned back in the chair slowly, exhaling through her nose. The names were different. The timelines barely overlapped, but the structure was unmistakable. These were not gang members in the traditional sense. These were men with ties to a private contractor that had survived by changing its skin. First Colburn, before that Perimeter West, and now something else entirely. A splinter network evolving quietly beneath the surface, wrapped in rural anger, and fed by veterans who had traded allegiance for extremism. Down the hallway, footsteps echoed toward the break room, boots against tile, soft and heavy. Tasha had stopped by the precinct not to fight, but to follow up on her statement, to check in on the younger officer who had first arrived at the station that night and had looked at her with something close to fear. She hadn't expected Lena to still be working, nor had she intended to eavesdrop, but when she passed the open records room and heard that name, Colburn Security, she stopped cold. Her breath caught as the weight of it dropped into her memory like a stone into still water. Iraq. Winter. 2011. She had been stationed at a transit checkpoint just outside Fallujah, working crowd coordination and gate security with a rotation of Allied units. It had been tense, even on the good days. The perimeter was constantly on edge, not because of insurgents, but because of the private contractor unit stationed nearby. A Colburn crew that answered to no one, not even the base commander. They had their own weapons, their own vehicles, and most disturbingly, their own rules. One of them, a tall man with pale blue eyes and a southern drawl, had once tried to intimidate a young Iraqi interpreter during a supply dispute. Tasha had stepped in, calm but firm, and made it clear the interpreter wasn't alone. Later that night, her tent had been slashed open. No formal report was filed. Her CO had advised her to let it go, that Colburn wasn't worth the headache. But she never forgot the way the man had looked at her afterward. Not with anger, with calculation, as if she had been added to some mental list. She stepped into the records room now, her voice level but firm, though the air around her felt different, charged by the weight of what she had just remembered. "Colburn Security," she said, and Lena looked up immediately. "Where did you see that name?" Lena handed her the file without question. "It's in the personnel background of one of the warehouse leads, a trainer named Caro. He was tied to Colburn and Perimeter West, both on the books, before they were scrubbed." Tasha stared at the page, her eyes narrowing. "I knew them. I ran into Colburn in Iraq. They were already dangerous then. Rogue, violent, almost untouchable. But what's worse is how many of them vanished after everything fell apart. Some disappeared into new companies. Some went private. Others, apparently, came here." Lena leaned forward, voice low. "It's not just the warehouse. I ran background checks on the equipment we seized. Half the gear has serial numbers linked to old Perimeter West shipments, night vision goggles, encrypted radios, even that battered satellite phone we found on site. These weren't bought off the street. Someone gave them these tools. Someone trained them. And someone's been keeping them protected." Tasha didn't flinch. "And they were testing something here. Not just me, not just a store, a method, a playbook." The room went quiet as the weight of it settled between them. "They came here to escalate," Lena said finally, "but they didn't expect you to hold the line. They expected chaos," Tasha replied. "But I've been through worse." She turned the page in the file and found a photograph, grainy, poorly scanned, of Wesley Caro standing beside a convoy truck, his face half hidden by sunglasses. Behind him, barely visible, was the edge of a logo on the canvas flap of the vehicle. A faded red triangle wrapped around a white outline. She knew that logo. She had seen it in Iraq, painted on a gate near the checkpoint, the symbol of a group that claimed it didn't exist anymore. Perimeter West. And then, suddenly, another memory surfaced, unbidden and clear. A classified investigation she'd been pulled into during her final deployment, a covert inquiry into misconduct among contractor units embedded with U.S. forces. She had helped build the case against a rogue Colburn squad that had been smuggling arms out of supply trucks, using tribal conflicts as cover for black market trades. She had testified under code, her name omitted from the final report. But not everyone had forgotten. One of the operatives exposed in that investigation had been court-martialed and dishonorably discharged. And that operative had a brother, a dropout, angry, impulsive. Tasha's blood ran cold. The one gang member who escaped the station before the fight was over. The one with the lip ring and the twitch in his hand, the only one she hadn't known by name, wasn't just some small-town racist with a grudge. He was related to the man she helped take down. And this entire thing, wasn't a random act of hate. It was personal. It was revenge. The silence inside Lena Hart's car was heavy as she sat parked outside the county clerk's office, the engine idling low and the interior dark except for the cold blue glow of her tablet screen. Rain tapped lightly on the windshield, rhythmic and soft, but her focus remained anchored on the screen in front of her. The secure login portal to an interagency archive system she was technically not supposed to have access to. She had used this clearance only twice before in her career, both times with hesitation. This time, there was none. She keyed in the last of the strings, bypassed a secondary authentication checkpoint, and held her breath as the files began to decrypt. It had taken her 3 favors and 1 phone call to an old contact at the National Personnel Records Center just to get near the classified folders buried under Tasha Daniels's military service number. On the surface, Tasha's record was clean. Honorable discharge, exemplary conduct, medals earned in Iraq, Afghanistan, and special commendations for her work in civilian military liaison units. But behind the walls of redactions, past layers of locked reports, was a file labeled only as Operation Dagger Set, JSOC Coordination, 2011. The details weren't all there. Even Lena's clearance hit a wall just before the field operation logs. But she saw enough. Tasha Daniels had participated in a black site investigation involving multiple agencies and a covert civilian contractor audit overseas. Her primary mission, though never publicly acknowledged, was surveillance and reporting of private military contractor corruption on Allied soil. Among the flagged organizations was Colburn Security Group, and within that, a domestic intelligence collection unit hidden behind the title Recruitment and Reintegration Division. The entire task force had been dissolved shortly after Tasha's report triggered internal escalation. The mission was deemed a closed file, a threat neutralized, but the pieces didn't line up anymore. Lena flipped to the attached memo dated 18 months after the operation's closure. A familiar name sat near the bottom of the page, Elijah Darnell, listed as a former senior field liaison for Colburn's stateside transition team. No formal record of prosecution. No resignation letter. No follow-up orders. Just an HR transfer. And silence. She minimized the report and opened the local DMV logs, cross-referencing vehicle ownership near Mason Pines. There it was. A gray, unmarked sedan registered under an LLC, with no website, no phone number, and no tax returns. One of the shell companies previously used by Colburn Security's domestic training division. The man in the car watching the gas station had a name. Elijah Darnell hadn't disappeared. He'd gone to ground. And he was still running a playbook Tasha had shut down years ago. Back at the gas station, the sky hung low and gray, the clouds pressing against the hills like a blanket full of unfinished storms. Tasha stood in the back room, arms braced against the counter, her eyes fixed on a printout Lena had given her that morning. A partial personnel list recovered from the warehouse raid. One name had been circled. She had stared at it for so long, the letters began to blur. Reed Bannett. She hadn't remembered it at first, but after the adrenaline had drained and the haze of combat had cleared, It came back. The dropout. The wild one. Younger brother of Daniel Bannett, the Colburn operative she'd helped expose in Fallujah. Daniel had been cold, methodical, a man who had treated war as currency and influence as power. Reed, on the other hand, had always been louder, sloppier, furious that his brother had been ruined by someone he described as just a soldier playing hero. He had made threats when Daniel was convicted. Tasha had dismissed them at the time. Empty, emotional. But revenge, she knew now, had a long shelf life. This had never been about the gas station. It had never been about the viral video or a gang of small-town racists trying to assert dominance. She had been a target from the beginning. Everything, the first confrontation, the second attack, the escalation into something that looked like organized hate, had all been part of a delayed act of vengeance. Reed had brought others into it. Others trained. Others radicalized. Others fed with the same rage Daniel had fostered when he was pushed out of the only power structure he understood. And behind them stood Darnell, quiet, calculating, pulling strings in the dark. As she stood there, a chill moved across her arms, not from fear, but from recognition. It wasn't over. It had never truly ended. A knock tapped lightly on the side door, two short and one long. Tasha opened it and found Lena standing there, face pale, the folder in her hand thicker than before. "I accessed it," Lena said without preamble. "I had to go deep, but I found the link, not just between Colburn and the gang, but between them and you. You were named in the report. Darnell saw your testimony. The whole operation. You triggered it. And now he's here." Tasha didn't blink. "So he's the one funding them?" Lena nodded. "He never left. He just went underground. He's using remnants of old Colburn infrastructure, reactivating men they trained, embedding them in rural towns. He's still building something, and you were never supposed to be alive to see it." Tasha looked out toward the trees where the road bent quietly in the distance. She could feel it now, the pattern. They weren't sending pawns anymore. They were escalating, and the next move wouldn't be an ambush. It would be a message. This wasn't just about finishing a fight. It was about preventing the next one. The rain had returned, soft and constant, drumming against the station's awning in a slow, whispering rhythm. As Tasha moved through the side hallway, behind the stockroom, cleaning out the last of the broken crates from the second attack. Most of the evidence had been logged and cleared, but she wanted to inspect everything herself. Every splintered box, every dented shelf, every trace left behind in the wake of a fight she'd won but hadn't yet finished. There was something about loose ends that didn't sit right with her. It was a soldier's habit, honed over years: secure the perimeter, sweep the area, clear the space. She knelt beside the collapsed metal shelving near the back wall, pushing aside a bent strip of ducting and the remains of a torn duffel that one of the gang members had dropped during the chaos. Most of it was junk: scrap wires, a rusted wrench, and a coil of cheap nylon rope. But beneath the mess, tucked into a crushed cereal box half buried under spilled motor oil, something buzzed once. Faint, but real. Not a vibration from the station's old freezer. Not a signal from her own phone. A different rhythm entirely. She reached in and pulled out a small black object, slick with oil and grime. A burner phone, mid-range, no ID, no password. It was powered on but had no SIM card inserted. Only a queue of unsent messages and a cracked screen flickering in grayscale. Tasha stared at it for a long moment, her pulse steady, her mind already working. Someone had stashed this here. Not recently. Not during the rooftop fight. This had been hidden earlier, possibly days ago. Likely a backup device left behind during planning. Maybe someone on the crew wasn't as loyal to Jace as they pretended to be. She wrapped the phone in a rag and carried it to the back office, her movements precise. Once inside, she sat at the desk and began scrolling through the files stored on the internal memory. There were no photos, no contact names, but there were messages, short, fragmented, and stripped of context. Confirm location. Silo intact. Drop rescheduled 11C. Use ridge path. East entrance only. Recruits cleared. Test pending. Watcher reported. Verify cleanup. Daniel's still in play. Priority remains. That last line pulled her focus into a blade. Whoever had used this phone hadn't just referenced the operation. They'd mentioned her by name, and not in passing. Priority remains. That wasn't random. That was operational language. She leaned back, mind racing. The phrases, 11C, ridge path, silo, drop points, weren't normal street talk. They were coded, layered, buried in terms that someone outside of certain training would overlook. But not her. She had learned to break code books by hand. In the field. Under pressure. She took a legal pad from the desk drawer, flipped to a clean sheet, and began to transcribe. She worked through the structure slowly, mapping every term against a field decryption grid she remembered from her final tour. The phrasing matched an old Range 9 grid cipher, one used in classified ops, with variable coordinates layered into natural landmarks. It took her an hour, 2 pots of black coffee, and an old military field manual from a box in her truck. But when she finished, she had a location. A warehouse, just off an abandoned freight spur near the edge of a decommissioned rail yard. She marked it on a physical map with a felt pen, then cross-referenced satellite images on Lena's tablet. The site looked dead. No vehicles, no power logs, and no obvious reason to draw attention. Which made it perfect for recruitment. Remote enough to stage training, quiet enough to move people and materials without interruption, hidden in plain sight. She picked up the burner again and reread the last unsent message. Recon complete. Daniels won't make it to Monday. There was no timestamp, no sender. But she understood what it meant. She wasn't just being watched. She had been scheduled for removal. Bartutilfif. That night, Lena arrived with someone Tasha hadn't met before. A woman in her early 40s, tall, dressed like a civilian, but with the eyes of someone used to rooms full of secrets. She introduced herself only as Megan Rourke, a federal liaison tied to a long-suspended internal investigation into unauthorized domestic surveillance by private security entities. Lena had pulled every string she had left to bring her in. We've had flags on Colburn's shell companies for years, Rourke explained as she reviewed the burner phone's contents. Problem was, they dissolved too cleanly, changed names, burned documents, moved funds into nonprofits and community training collectives. We couldn't pin anything down. Tasha handed her the map and tapped the coordinates. They're still training, still recruiting, and they've already tested deployment. Rourke nodded. We can move, quietly. No sirens, no paperwork that hits the state systems until after we're in. They worked through the night drafting the warrant, sealed under federal jurisdiction, limited to a 4-hour entry window, no leaks, no press. Tasha would not be part of the raid. Lena made that clear. You've done enough, she said. You gave us the key. Let us turn it. But Tasha didn't reply right away. She stood by the window, looking out into the stillness where the trees met the sky, and the shadows between them never seemed to lift. Her reflection stared back from the glass, tired, bruised, but more alert than ever. She wasn't afraid of what came next. She was ready for it. The warehouse sat in silence, squat and rectangular, built from weather-worn corrugated steel, with no visible signage, and a gravel drive that had long since disappeared beneath a thin crust of weeds. It looked abandoned, intentionally so, but appearances, Tasha knew, were the last thing to trust. As the unmarked black SUVs rolled up under cover of dawn, their lights off and tires crunching soft against the earth, the building loomed like a sleeping animal, still on the outside, but dangerous just beneath. Inside one of the vehicles, Lena Hart reviewed the raid layout one last time with the federal contact beside her. Megan Rourke held the warrant in one hand and a compact pistol in the other, her expression unreadable as she nodded to the agents readying their gear. There would be no announcement, no warning. This was a sweep, sanctioned quietly, and meant to send no signal beyond its final report. At exactly 5:42 a.m., the breach team moved. They entered through the side loading dock and back personnel door simultaneously, flashlights sweeping in a coordinated arc, commands low and crisp. There was no resistance, no gunfire, no occupants, but the building wasn't empty, not even close. Rows of metal shelves had been repurposed into makeshift barricades. Training mannequins wearing gas masks and tactical vests stood upright in formation. Folded tarps covered crates that held not farm equipment or spare tires, as one might expect from the building's cover story, but military-grade hardware, modified rifles, flashbangs, encrypted communication devices, and surplus field armor tagged with serial numbers long since reported as lost by decommissioned branches. In the far corner, beside a low folding table with 2 cold cups of instant coffee still half full, they found the wall. Not a wall in the structural sense, but one constructed for purpose. A corkboard nearly 10 feet wide, covered in overlapping documents, grainy photos, maps with pinned flags, and columns of handwritten notes in red ink. Across the center was a heading in block letters: Loyalty Validation Cycle 2. Field Ready. One agent began snapping photos immediately. Another opened the central file cabinet tucked beneath the board and began pulling folders, each labeled with a code name and a profile beneath: height, weight, training history, psychological notes, flagged behavioral incidents. It was an applicant roster. Each one matched a name from the gang raid, and beside each profile was a field report, most marked incomplete, except one. Monroe, Jace, observed, confirmed. Lena stepped closer. Her breath slowed as her eyes traced the board, moving from the roster to the adjacent section labeled Engagement Test Phase 2. Beneath it were timestamps, coordinates, and video stills, frames pulled from drone surveillance positioned far above Tasha's gas station, each image annotated with field notes. Subject provoked. Target escalated. Observation successful. And pinned near the top left corner, slightly faded but unmistakable, was a photo of Tasha Daniels in full combat gear, crouched beside a transport vehicle somewhere in Iraq. Her face turned slightly from the lens, sun cutting across her jawline, dust layered into every crease of her uniform. The date in the corner read, Jan, 2011. Rourke stepped in quietly, her face unreadable as she took in the scene. They weren't just radicalizing, she said. They were formalizing it. Lena didn't respond right away. She was staring at another sheet, one taped slightly off-center, containing a detailed breakdown of the gas station incident. It listed Jace's movements, the initial confrontation, the retreat, the vandalism, and the rooftop fight. Each stage was labeled with operational codes, and at the bottom, one phrase stood out in bold red: Live Field Assessment. Successful. Back at the station, Tasha stood beside her truck, the early light just brushing the tops of the trees. She hadn't joined the raid, Lena had insisted, but her mind had never left it. When the call came in, Lena's voice was calm, but the weight behind it pressed through every syllable. We found the board, she said. You were on it. Tasha's hand gripped the edge of her truck bed as Lena continued. They staged it, all of it, the fight, the return, the escape. It was never just personal. It was theater. They were filming the entire thing, testing Jace, testing how you'd respond, seeing how a trained target would handle organized aggression. They weren't punishing you. They were measuring him. Tasha didn't speak at first. The realization folded through her slowly. Painful, yes, but clarifying. She had been defending herself, yes, but she had also been unwillingly participating in someone else's initiation ritual. The violence had been real, the hate unmistakable. But the choreography had been planned with precision, designed to push both sides into action, all under the gaze of unseen handlers who now sat somewhere reviewing the footage, grading the outcome. It had never been just about her. It had been about validating a system, testing a pipeline that took men with rage and turned them into tools for something larger, something quieter, something that didn't need a name because it had learned how to live without one. "Where's Darnell?" Tasha asked finally. Lena's voice dropped lower. "Gone. The office was wiped. He left before the raid hit. But we have enough. The photos, the lists, the drone footage. We can prove the structure exists. We just need time to follow it." Tasha looked out at the trees again, at the long gravel path beyond the station that disappeared into the woods. The same path that had once felt like safety now felt like the edge of a map where monsters were redrawn with each revelation. She thought of every man who had stepped through her door with a grin, a sneer, or a fist. And then she thought of who had sent them. This wasn't just survival anymore. It was exposure. And it wasn't just her fight now. The files recovered from the warehouse didn't just speak. They roared. Within hours of the raid, digitized copies of the surveillance logs, loyalty test sheets, and personnel files had been uploaded to a secure federal database. Megan Rourke moved quickly, bypassing state channels entirely, and contacting a senior agent in the FBI's Domestic Terror Task Force. The call was short. The evidence said enough. Within a day, a federal order had been issued to begin dismantling every trace of the structure built beneath Colburn Security's original framework. By the third day, subpoenas had been issued. Search warrants expanded. What began in a forgotten warehouse on the edge of Mason Pines unfolded into a national operation. Every location tied to Colburn's former executives, shell companies, and training affiliates was examined. Offices in Georgia, Nevada, and the Carolinas were raided simultaneously. Server farms were seized, back-end ledgers, buried accounts, false nonprofit records, all of it laid bare in the space of 72 hours. But the most pressing question remained, where was Elijah Darnell? It was Tasha who found the clue, not in a database or memo, but in a voice recording buried in the burner phone's cache, overwritten but not deleted properly. With the help of Lena's contacts, it was restored. In the clipped audio, Darnell's voice could be heard briefing two men, one of them Jace Monroe, about a field validation test. But the last line was the one that mattered. "Once the test concludes, I'll meet Reed at the Crescent site. He'll handle cleanup. You keep Daniels active. Make her sweat. She's not the target yet, just the bait." That was the line that changed everything. They weren't just trying to provoke Tasha. She had been used as a trap, a stressor to test whether their recruits would break under pressure or execute with discipline. Lena handed the recording over to the FBI. Within 48 hours, a task force located the Crescent site, an off-grid property in West Virginia leased under a dummy name. Darnell was there. So was Reed Bannett, armed and unaware that their time had run out. The arrest was clean, swift, no shots fired. Darnell didn't speak during transport, but Reed tried to yell something as they dragged him away. It was garbled and slurred, some mix of loyalty, betrayal, and personal vengeance, but none of it mattered. The indictment would speak louder than either of them ever could. Federal charges were filed for conspiracy to incite domestic terrorism, unlawful weapons distribution, and attempted assassination of a protected veteran witness. Darnell's past as a private military contractor only deepened the scandal, and Jace Monroe, found unconscious on Tasha's rooftop, was no longer simply a gang member. Once the warehouse intel matched up with the video footage and the voice logs, Jace's role became clear. He was the selected subject of the Monroe test, as the documents labeled it, a full-stage loyalty scenario designed to mimic combat against a hardened opponent. It had been filmed, reviewed, ranked. He never knew that the moment he laid hands on Tasha, he'd already failed. He recovered in a federal medical facility under armed guard, then was transferred to a secure holding center. He was charged with aggravated assault, hate crimes under federal law, and material participation in a paramilitary conspiracy. And when prosecutors revealed that he'd been promised rank within Darnell's restructured network, lead status, the file said, his silence cracked. He tried to claim he didn't know what he was a part of. But the footage, the audio, and the lists said otherwise. In the weeks that followed, the gang began to unravel completely. With Jace, Reed, and the others in custody, and the handlers exposed, the small cells built around them, those who had been feeding weapons, laundering money, and running communications, lost all cover. Half the crew that had vandalized the gas station had records under other names. The rest were tied to failed militia startups across the southeast. Some were arrested in routine traffic stops. Others tried to run. None made it far. The operation that had once believed it could operate in plain sight, with code words, loyalty drills, and quiet recruitment, was shattered. Their trucks were impounded, their weapons seized, their plans dissected, piece by piece. And while the network may have once dreamed of expansion, it would now be remembered as a fractured conspiracy, ruined by its own arrogance. And through it all, Tasha never once stepped in front of a camera. Lena's promotion came quietly, without fanfare, but the badge they handed her carried more weight than most. She had been offered a federal liaison role within the Joint Task Force on Counter-Extremism, an assignment that didn't come from politicking or ambition, but from action. Her work in Mason Pines was cited as the model for small-town enforcement, stepping up when larger systems looked away. She accepted the post without ceremony. The only person she told in person was Tasha. Tasha didn't say much when she heard. She just gave her a firm nod and said, "Make sure they don't forget where it started." Not long after, the formal request arrived, sealed with the Senate's emblem, delivered by a federal courier. They were asking her to testify, not as a victim, not as a headline, as a decorated veteran, a survivor, a voice that could explain exactly how domestic terror had almost made its home at her back door. She didn't want to, but Viola, from her spot on the couch, recovering with a blanket across her knees and a mug of chamomile in hand, said what needed saying. "They don't get to speak over you, not after all this." So Tasha said yes. Her testimony was calm, steady, unmoved by the cameras or the murmurs in the gallery. She wore a plain suit and no insignia, and when asked how she managed to take down a trained gang in close quarters, she answered simply, "Because I was trained too. I just used it for something else." Afterward, the committee members shook her hand. Some of them couldn't quite meet her eyes. Back in Mason Pines, the gas station changed in ways that couldn't be seen in blueprints. New glass replaced the ones broken in the second attack. A fresh sign went up, same name, but with reinforced lettering and soft lighting beneath it. The bulletproof window stayed, but so did the welcome mat. Viola returned to her morning shifts slowly, her limp easing with physical therapy and community visits. And when she was strong enough to stand without her cane, the first thing she did was pull weeds from the flower beds out front, smiling the whole time. But the most lasting change was what happened behind the station. The day after Viola came home, Tasha walked the narrow path past the dumpsters, behind the fence where the ambush had first unfolded. She stood where the fight had started, where she had made her stand, and stared at the gravel long enough to feel the silence again. She remembered the way Jace had smirked when he stepped forward. She remembered the thud of fists, the breathless calculation of combat, and the sharp, sudden pain that had traced down her side like fire. But more than that, she remembered the people she hadn't been able to protect, the interpreters, the civilians, the other women who hadn't made it home. For all her strength, she had carried those names quietly for years. That morning, with no one watching, she sat down against the concrete wall, leaned her head back, and cried. Not from pain, from release. That evening, Lena came by, not in uniform, not with a file in hand, but with a six-pack of soda and a bag of takeout. They sat on the porch until the sun dipped low, and they talked, not about cases or raids or warrants, but about things that mattered more, about growing up in small towns, about loneliness and pride, about what happens when people stop pretending they're fine and finally speak. Before she left, Lena said, "You know you could teach." Tasha raised an eyebrow. "I'm serious," she added. "Self-defense. Community center's been asking for something real for a while now. Something taught by someone who's lived it." Tasha didn't answer right away. But the next day, she called the director. A year later, the gas station didn't just recover, it thrived. Locals made it their stop by choice, not just necessity. Tourists passed through on long drives and left with more than gas. They left with stickers of the station logo redesigned by a local teen, stories about the mural, and sometimes photos taken under the painted tribute that stood proudly on the back wall. A full-body mural of Tasha, painted in bold brushstrokes by 3 local artists, stood behind the register. She was painted mid-stance, left foot slightly forward, chin lifted, fists down but ready. The caption beneath said, "We fight to live, not to hate." Inside the community center, a weekly class filled the rec room with movement. Tasha taught close-quarter defense, grounding techniques, verbal assertion. The girls who came, some quiet, some loud, all eager, called her Coach D. And when the school invited her to speak for Career Day, she stood at the front of a crowded auditorium and told them the truth. Not the polished kind, the kind with grit and consequence. "I don't want you to be fearless," she told them. "I want you to know what to do when the fear comes. And I want you to remember, you're allowed to take up space, especially when someone tells you not to." They applauded, not because they were told to, but because they knew she meant it. Tasha didn't talk about Iraq much anymore, but she didn't hide it either. The scars didn't need explanation. The past didn't need to stay in the shadows. It walked with her now, not as a burden, but as proof. Justice hadn't come quickly. It hadn't come cleanly, but it came, because she stood her ground. And when the moment came, she never backed down. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.